Hey guys, I'm Stephen Liu. Today I'm going to talk about NodeJS and how to actually use it and the ins and outs. A little bit about myself. I'm an engineer at Abacus. I basically do JavaScript. I breathe, eat, live JavaScript day to day. So I'll talk to you a little bit on how to actually write a Node.js application. So the first thing you need to know about Node is that it's different from every language that you're typically used to. Instead of running everything synchronously, everything about Node is non-blocking. So everything you can do in parallel, essentially. So an example of this is like this terrible PHP code where when we get down to fread here, we have to wait for PHP to read that file into the variable. And sometimes that can take a very long time if you're doing like over a gig worth of data or more. And then at the end here, we're trying to get the contents of MLH. Unfortunately, both of those things don't depend on each other. So why are we waiting for, reading in the file if we can just get the site at the same time? So this is where kind of like JavaScript comes into play, or like essentially what we're doing here is reading the file, that takes 2 seconds, and then printing the file. And then instantly we go to getting the site and taking another 2 seconds to print the site. And in theory, this blocking code would take about 4 seconds. So Node.js kind of brings in parallelism here. So instead, what we do is we read the file in here. And when we're done reading the file, we can print out what we read from the file. But at the same time, we don't need to really block on it. So we also do request.get for the site and print out the body of the site when it's done. So in theory, it looks something like this, where like the single event thread is in the center. So we read the file, and then we essentially tell Node.js, when I'm done reading the file, I need to print the file later. And then right at the next second when we execute the read file function, we get the site, which also we say when the site is done being pulled in, we need to print out the site. So if those operations both take 2 seconds, and we can do them both at the same time, this non-blocking code takes about 2 seconds. So the key takeaway here is you never need to wait for I/O. Input outputs like file reading, getting data, requesting data, or doing anything of that sort. You can run multiple I/O operations without blocking each other. So if you really want to follow along to my next part on how to write code in Node.js, you can just like go to this link. There's a lot of different tutorials out there that can tell you like how to get Node.js installed into your machine. But I'll skip that part because it's kind of boring. So we're going to talk about how Node.js pulls in certain modules and how you can create your own modules. So the first example is you can use require. So require is built into Node.js, and there are several modules that Node gives you. FS is file system. That is one of the modules that Node gives you. So an example of this here is like we require the file system and put all of its functions into the variable FS. Now I can create other modules too within my app, but I have to put the / to refer that it is in my current working directory. If you don't, it's going to try to look up the global module list. You don't need the .js extension, it'll automatically append it to you. And you can also refer folders, but inside that folder, you must have an index.js for it to work. So we just talked about pulling in modules. Now we're gonna I'm going to show you how to actually like create a module. So an example of this would be like if I create a name.js, I can use module.exports and place a function into there. Anything you place in module.exports gets exported to wherever you use it. You can put objects, you can put variables. In my example, I'm doing a function. To use it in another file, you simply just use the require statement that we just learned about and execute the function at the end. And so this would actually output my name is Stephen Liu. Cool. So let's build something a little more complex. And along the way, I'll tell you what like roadblocks we'll like put in, so that way you can learn a little bit more about Node and all of the different things. So the first thing is we want to obtain an array of keys, in an object. That last part is wrong. So here's a very small example. So like I put my card here. If you want to contact me, it's right there. So essentially I want to take all the keys, which are like GitHub, Twitter, name, email, company, and website. Those are the keys, and I just want to print out those keys. So the real basic way to do this is just doing a for in loop. So for var detail and card. I'll push all the keys in there. I also push the values in there, but you don't need to do that. And then when I execute it, I can run node keys.js, and that's the output that I get. So there's this cool thing where that kind of function already exists out in the world, and I don't really want to make my own like I just did. So there's this cool repository called Node Package Manager, and they include a ton of different modules that are open source down in the web. You can get the whole list by going to that site. And essentially, I'm going to pull in someone's function to help me do this job, with the same way as using require. So for how I'm going to do this is I'm going to run npm. So the first line is npm install Lodash, and I'm going to save it to my current folder. And if you see, what npm does is create a folder called node modules, which then if I run my, when I run node, it will import all the node modules in that folder. So the next part is I'm going to rewrite keys to a more easy way of than what I did before. And as you see here, I reduced my code to essentially nothing. And I used a require statement at the top to include the module that I just installed. And at the end, I just call a function which is included in that module, and I get the same exact output. So I'm going to get it a little more in depth. From what I kind of described before about how Node is non-blocking, this should block, right? So if I do request.getMLH, right, I should, in normal logic of synchronous programming languages, I have to wait for that site to be pulled down, which could take some time, you never know. And then I can get to printing out the keys on my card. But in Node.js, this is not the case. So I'll give you a small example of how that works. My text is really small. So this is the same exact code. I'm going to run it real quick. So if I run this file, you'll see that my keys at the top have printed first before I actually printed the site. This is because I ran an IO operation, which is non-blocking. And so that way I can go down to the next parts of my code and execute that. So if you see the site here, which is cool, they got this nice little ASCII art. You'll see that the order of operations here is dependent on how fast the site loads. Cool. And if you want to create a web application, Unfortunately, web applications in Node take a little time to like explain. But the easiest way to get started is using npm and installing what we call the Express generator. So Express is a framework to create your application in. It only includes the controller and the views, but does not include the models in MVC. If you want, and then right afterwards, you run the command express my app, and it will create the folder and the entire node structure for you to get started with your site. And that's it.
Awesome. So, questions. First off is, for people who want to learn Node.js, like where are the best resources to go to beyond like your talk and some of the tools you mentioned?
Cool. So a lot about Node.js. If you want to learn Node.js and how to like create sites, the best resource that I found that I use is just like kind of like Googling your way through. But there are kind of tutorials out there if you like type in like Express 4 and so forth. You'll find some tutorials on how like Express works to its entirety. Express.js also has their own website, which goes step by step on how to actually create your site. And it's probably better at explaining it than I am.
How do you know what, like when Node is right for a project? Like obviously there's certain tools that are good for certain jobs. Like what kind of jobs is Node good for versus other languages?
So yeah, that's actually a very good question. It's really dependent. In my opinion, Node.js is a very great language because at a startup that I'm currently into, your backend code will be very similar to your front-end code. So you don't have any gaps in between like, oh, your front-end guy needs to learn Ruby in order to write backend code. Node.js is also one of the better, it's also a very good asynchronous programming language compared to like PHP, which is synchronous, Ruby, which is also synchronous. If you want to dabble into a very fast web application, Node is a very good way to get started.
What are the most common like pitfall patterns that people run into in Node, like big places that people stumble?
Right. So a lot of the pitfalls is honestly two things. Getting started with JavaScript and then understanding essentially how Node handles requests or Express handles requests. Because JavaScript by behavior is all callback functions, you getting like very familiar with that and knowing how like you can create essentially a synchronous application through callbacks. That will be the first thing, the roadblock that you kind of have to get through. And then once you get past knowing JavaScript really to its entirety, the next part is understanding how Express or Node incorporates into JavaScript. And that's like basically the two major roadblocks I've had in the past.
So obviously Express is a pretty popular framework in Node. Are there other frameworks that you have experience with? Like what other ones would you recommend, or other tools even you would recommend for Node?
Right. So Express is very unopinionated. It's also extremely small and you can do a lot of things many different ways. There are other cool ones that I haven't personally used, but Meteor is one of them. Meteor kind of like is more opinionated, but can really get you started off the ground.
How does Meteor compare to Express, like in general?
In general, I couldn't really give you like great concrete examples, but Meteor is more like heavily and tightly integrated to the front end, so that way you don't have to like pretty much duplicate code.
Cool. Any closing thoughts?
If you want to know more about Node, just tweet me at Stephen Liu, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.